In the 4th year since Oscar passed away, I went to his grave, hoping to speak with him, only to find that the grave had been moved. Panicked, I returned home and told my son to call the police. With a sigh, my son replied, "Mom, Dad's grave was never there. He's buried with Mrs. Isolde. He always said that when he was alive, he was forced to marry someone he didn't love. His only wish was to be buried with the person he loved after death." The Isolde he mentioned was the woman Oscar had been pining for 30 years. When I opened my eyes again, I was back to the day Oscar abandoned me. Who was miscarrying? To go look for Isolde. This time, I didn't beg. Instead, I quietly booked a ticket to leave. Chapter 1. Reborn into this old society. I stayed in the hospital for 3 days, until the pain in my abdomen became bearable enough to check out. During these 3 days, Oscar didn't come even once. I took the medication, received the injections, and handled all the payments by myself. He was too busy comforting Isolde, who he thought was forced into marriage, wiping her tears and soothing her emotions. He didn't have time for me. Back at home, I was packing my things when Oscar entered, scanning the house with an unhappy glance. "You've been home for 3 days and you haven't even bothered to tidy up? It's a mess in here." To be fair, all that was out of place were the unmade bed and a few clothes scattered around. But this was the way he always was. Any small inconvenience would make him turn on his frown. I gave him a fleeting look, not pausing in my packing. I said indifferently, "I just got out of the hospital." Oscar paused, lips pressed together as he watched me for a moment. Oddly enough, he reached out to help me organize the wardrobe, his tone softening. "How's your recovery?" I couldn't help but scoff. I never expected him to ask that. 3 days ago, when he abandoned me, bleeding and suffering, to chase after Isolde, he didn't look back once. "I'm fine," I replied, not lifting my eyes from my task. Stuffing my clothes into the bag, Oscar noticed my actions and casually asked, "Why are you separating our clothes?" "I'm taking them to be washed," I replied, still not giving him any expression. Clearly, he didn't care about what I was planning to do. He nodded absent-mindedly and didn't say more. After placing the bag in the firewood room, I returned to the house. Oscar was holding a delicately wrapped bag, smiling softly as he waved it at me. "Come here. I bought this for you in the city." I stood still. He didn't seem annoyed at my lack of response. Instead, he walked toward me with a bright smile. Tearing open the bag, he pulled out a bridal veil and gently placed it on my head. He led me to the mirror and nodded with a smile. "When I saw the bride wearing this veil at the wedding, my first thought was that you'd look amazing in it. So, I bought it for you." Staring at the reflection of myself in the veil, a wave of bitterness filled my chest. In my past life, I had longed for a veil from Oscar, even hoping he would propose a second wedding. But this time, he had only bought it because I hadn't thrown a tantrum. Had it been in the past, I would have been deeply touched. But now, my heart had long turned to stone. I removed the veil and said flatly, "I don't like this." Oscar was taken aback by my cold response, his face filled with disbelief as he stared at me with narrowed eyes, as if saying, "You really don't know what's good for you." His voice turned harsh. "Fine, do whatever you want, but I have something to tell you. The factory is planning to nominate you for advanced worker status, and Isolde is next in line after you. You should go to the factory and tell them you want to give up your spot and let Isolde have it instead." I looked at him with dull eyes, no surprise in my expression. "So, that's what all this charm was about. This opportunity is one I earned myself." I made my stance clear. No, I wasn't giving it up. He looked at me impatiently, frowning tightly. "Isolde has moved to the city now. Only advanced workers are eligible to work there. As a woman, can't you understand her situation?" I scoffed. Isolde had already gotten married, and yet he was still so devoted to making plans for her. No wonder he had been thinking about her for over 30 years. Thinking back to my past life, the advanced worker position I had earned was suddenly revoked, and it was given to Isolde. Now, judging by his attitude, I was sure he had found a way to sabotage my qualification just to give it to her. "I'm not giving it up." I looked away calmly. "I earned this position on my own." Oscar's anger flared at my composed response. He clenched his fists, gritting his teeth. Susanna, I truly don't know how I ended up marrying such a cold-hearted woman. You have no compassion at all. He slammed the door so hard that the already worn-out wood creaked and groaned. Chapter 2. Oscar went back to the city and didn't return that night. I found out through the ticket seller who happened to mention it. It was clear where he had gone. In my past life, Oscar never went to the city after an argument. He'd only spend a night at the school office to avoid me, and the next morning, I'd be the one at the school gate, begging him to come home, or perhaps, when he went to the city, I never knew about it at all. But this time, I would never crush my own pride to please him again. I bought a train ticket to Guangdong, leaving in 5 days, and didn't rush home. Instead, I took a stroll around the city. This was my second time in the city, the first time being when Oscar had brought me here. As I walked along the street, memories of when Oscar and I first started dating flooded my mind. We had met through a blind date. He was straightforward, not really good at coaxing girls. After only meeting a few times, he asked me, "Do you want to go for a walk around the city?" As we walked through the city, he pointed out every odd and interesting thing. He bought me cotton candy, candied fruit, and lots of hairpins. It was my first time trying those overly sweet, sticky treats. As we walked, he nervously held my hand. I could feel his heart racing, and he said, "Susanna, I don't really know how to treat a girl well. I heard that if you like someone, you should buy them things." Back then, I didn't understand love confessions, so I muddled through and ended up with him. If I had known back then that Oscar often came to the city to pursue Isolde, I probably wouldn't have been so eager to visit the city again. I spent half my life waiting for Oscar, and only after Isolde passed away from illness did his attitude toward me change. I thought that finally, my iron tree had bloomed, and love had found its conclusion, but little did I know, it was all just a delusion. In Oscar's eyes, I was just someone he married out of obligation, with no love involved. His heart would always belong to Isolde. As I walked down the street, a familiar figure caught my attention, and I stopped in my tracks. Oscar was riding a bicycle with Isolde sitting behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist. She was smiling sweetly, looking as if she were in heaven. But the moment she saw me, Oscar's smile froze on his face. Isolde was the first to get off the bike and greet me, her eyes sizing me up with amusement. She laughed. "Susanna, are you here to find Oscar? He just told me you'd probably beg him to come back home." Her words were filled with mockery and disdain. Oscar walked over, pushing the bike, his face showing obvious displeasure. "Who told you to come? Don't think I'm the same as before. Just because you begged me, I'll come back home with you." Seeing the smug look on his face, I remained unfazed and replied, "I'm just passing by." Oscar frowned, clearly not believing me. His tone softened as he approached me. "Fine. I don't want to argue with you. Let's go back." "No need." I pulled away and walked toward the side. Oscar grabbed my wrist, his expression dark, caught off guard by his sudden yank. I accidentally bumped my abdomen against a bike parked by the roadside. The sharp pain immediately spread throughout my body, and I crouched down, feeling tightness all over. Oscar's face flashed with panic as he quickly squatted beside me, asking urgently, "What happened? Did you hurt your stomach? Come on, I'll take you to the hospital." I frowned, sweat trickling down my forehead from the pain, and nodded weakly. He helped me up and placed me on the bike, quickly pedaling forward. But after only a few steps, Isolde screamed in pain. Oscar immediately stopped the bike and rushed over to her. "What happened?" Isolde, sitting on the ground, pointed to her ankle and said, "I think I sprained my foot." Oscar let go of the bike and went to her. I knew at that moment, he wouldn't take me to the hospital anymore. Sure enough, Oscar hesitated for only a moment before he helped me down and said apologetically, "Isolde's injury is more serious. Wait for me here. I'll take her to the hospital first, then come back for you." "Hang on." He rushed off with Isolde, never once looking back at me. I wasn't foolish enough to continue waiting for him. Struggling to get up, I walked to a nearby pharmacy and bought some painkillers. Chapter 3. After returning home, I didn't rush to leave immediately. I had bought my train ticket for the day after the factory's advanced worker results were announced, though I knew that the factory would be shutting down in a few years and cutting staff. But I didn't want to let go of what should have been mine, especially not to Isolde. After all, in my past life, Isolde had taken this very qualification from me and mocked me repeatedly, even stealing many things I cherished. I went to the factory to make it clear that this spot belonged to me. It was something I had earned. On the day the results were supposed to be released, the section chief called me to the factory. Oscar and Isolde were there as well. Since he went to the city last time, he hadn't come back. I imagined he had spent these days taking care of Isolde day and night. His gaze landed on me like a layer of frost, his anger seeping through as he harshly reprimanded. "Didn't I tell you to give up your spot?" I replied indifferently. I never agreed to that. Isolde, her eyes red from crying, tugged at Oscar's arm and said, "Oscar, I know you'll make this right for me." Oscar's cold stare softened immediately, and his face filled with concern as he handed her a handkerchief to wipe her tears. His voice was so tender it made my skin crawl. "Yeah, I'll help you." The section chief awkwardly cleared his throat twice and turned to me. "Susanna, Oscar said you were going to give up the advanced worker nomination. Is that what you really want?" He was a smart man, easily recognizing the situation. His question was clearly aimed at supporting me. I shook my head. "I never said I wanted to give it up." The section chief nodded helplessly and turned to Oscar. "You see? Susanna herself hasn't said she's willing to give up her spot. Whatever others say doesn't matter." Isolde burst into tears again and buried her face into Oscar's chest, sobbing. "Oscar, you promised me you'd help." Oscar pulled her into his embrace, and the tenderness in his eyes almost broke me. I had always thought he was a refined and reserved man. He never showed affection in front of others, no hugs, no hand-holding. Even the smallest gestures would make him uncomfortable. I remembered one time when I went to pick him up from work. I accidentally brushed my pinky against his hand. He immediately turned cold, scolding me harshly in front of the neighbors, saying I was disrespecting his image as a teacher and that I never thought about his reputation. I had believed in his nature all those years, forcing myself to swallow the unfairness he imposed on me, convincing myself to understand his temperament. But now, seeing how he poured his heart out for another woman, I finally understood. It wasn't me he didn't understand, it was that he simply didn't love me. Oscar's voice snapped me back from my thoughts as he tightened his grip around Isolde. He then said with resolve, "I remember the factory rule, advanced workers have to be married." The section chief froze for a moment and nodded. "Yes, that's the rule." Isolde turned her face toward me, giving me a provocative look. I clenched my fists, my tongue dry, already knowing what he was about to say. In my past life, he had openly shared my scars and secrets with everyone to help Isolde. He hadn't hesitated for a second. Without any shame, he had said in front of all the office staff, "Susanna and I aren't even legally married. Her parents sold her to an old man when she was a child bride, and her household registration is still tied up there." "Enough!" I screamed, cutting him off. Tears burned in my eyes, and I forced a bitter laugh. He had promised never to share this secret with anyone. That was the darkest, most painful secret of my life, and he had betrayed me for Isolde. The pain in my chest made it hard to breathe. I realized then what it truly felt like to be utterly disappointed in someone. I calmed myself, looked at the section chief, and said, "He's right. I don't have any connection to him. I don't want the advanced worker spot anymore." I turned to Oscar, my tone numb and detached. "Give this qualification to your beloved Isolde. From now on, we have no ties." Chapter 4. The people in the office were still processing the shock of the situation, and the section chief threw me a concerned glance, but he didn't speak for a long time. It wasn't until Isolde, with tear-filled eyes and a smile on her face, spoke up. "Section chief, does this mean the advanced worker spot should go to me?" Oscar remained silent. His lips pressed tightly together as he stared at me. His eyes betrayed a mix of unease and regret. I didn't respond to his gaze, since he had already spoken those words. Whether or not he still felt guilty didn't matter to me anymore. I turned to the section chief and said, "Section chief, if there's nothing else, I'll be leaving now." By the time the section chief snapped out of his daze, I was already at the door. He suddenly shouted, No, the advanced worker spot should be yours. I stopped in my tracks and turned to look at him. His eyes were filled with tears. He continued. Susanna, we didn't know you had to endure such a life before. Now that we know, we won't look down on you, whether or not you're married. Your performance at the factory speaks for itself, and that's something everyone can agree on. Everyone knew how mistreated child brides were. Neglect, disregard, and abuse. Every negative word had been my reality. I had been born into a financial transaction. I could never forget the suffocating despair I felt when I was sent to live with a man 30 years older than me, paralyzed from the waist down. It took me a whole year to escape. I fled to a place where no one knew my past, thinking I could start anew. When I told Oscar this secret, it was because he was the only one who had ever treated me kindly. But little did I know, in the last life, he had exposed what I thought was a hidden secret. No need. Section Chief, if she wants it, give it to her. Also, my resignation still hasn't been approved. Can you push it through quickly? I wasn't holding on to anything. After saying this, I turned to leave. Oscar chased after me. His expression was hesitant, and after a long pause, he finally spoke. Susanna, I'm sorry. I only said that in the heat of the moment. Seeing me act indifferent seemed to stir up some guilt in him. I scoffed, finding him laughable, and shot him a cold look. No need to apologize. After all, she's the one you love. We had no relationship to begin with, so this treatment is only fair to me. Oscar's jaw tightened. In a small voice, he said, Don't say that. I only consider her a good friend. How could we have no relationship? We're husband and wife, and everyone knows it. Just 10 minutes ago, he had distanced himself from me for Isolde's sake, and now he was saying these words to salvage his meager sense of guilt. I responded coldly. You don't need to say these unnecessary things. I turned to the section chief and bade him farewell. I'm leaving now. Section Chief. Oscar stepped forward and called out. Where are you going? You don't need to know. I ignored him and walked away without looking back. Oscar stood there, stunned, and after a long while, he shouted at my back. Then come back soon. I'll be waiting for you at home. I hurriedly boarded the train to Guangdong. Before I left, I had checked my savings, which amounted to 15,000 yuan, my hard-earned savings over nearly 10 years. When I arrived in Guangdong, I rented a small room. From my memories of my past life, I knew the textile factory would go bankrupt within 5 years and lay off staff. Meanwhile, the electrical appliance factories were growing rapidly, manufacturing color TVs and refrigerators. Guangdong was the place with the largest labor force, and it was close to the raw materials. I didn't have enough capital, so I opened a small breakfast shop with the money I had. Though it was tiring, seeing the money grow day by day made me content. Half a month later, I received a letter from my old village. I recognized the handwriting as Lily's, the only person in the village who had supported my decision to leave. Her situation was similar to mine, an unloved husband, constantly waiting for him to come home. In her letter, she said she admired my courage in leaving, asked what I was doing now, and wished me the best for the future. She also mentioned that the advanced worker spot was still mine. The section chief hadn't given it to Isolde. Instead, he had cancelled her 5-year eligibility due to bribery and cheating. She also wrote that since I left, Oscar had been in a constant state of despair, standing by the door of his house every evening. When people asked why he didn't go inside, he said he was waiting for me to come back. I wrote back, telling her that if things weren't going well for her, she could come find me at any time. I resumed my early morning routine of pushing the tricycle to sell breakfast. These days were exhausting, but without Oscar in my life, I felt like I was truly happy. At least now, I didn't have to worry or feel sad about being abandoned by him. Less than a week later, Lily showed up at my rented room with a bag of luggage. I had just finished pushing my cart and smiled at her. Did you think it through? Lily smiled and helped me push the cart into the yard, gently replying, Yes. She rented the room next door, and together we ran the breakfast shop, making double the money we did before. A month later, we had saved up 40,000 yuan. We immediately went to the market to inquire about electrical appliance raw materials. It wasn't easy. We spent several days searching but didn't find any suitable materials. Then, Lily told me, "Today, I found a small workshop that makes electrical appliances. The owner is from out of town, and I heard he's planning to sell it. Let's check it out tomorrow. If it's suitable, we can take over the workshop." The next day, we visited the owner. He showed us the workshop, which was a good size and within our budget. "Boss Sue, what price are you asking for this workshop?" After the tour, I was satisfied and asked about the price. Boss Sue took a moment to size us up before asking a seemingly unrelated question. "Do you have any technical workers for electrical appliance manufacturing? Do you know anything about this industry?" His question caught us off guard. Neither Lily nor I knew much about the industry. We had just jumped in headfirst. Seeing us exchange a look, Boss Sue seemed to understand. He thought for a while, then said, "This workshop is my life's work. If it weren't for some personal matters back home, I wouldn't consider selling it." An idea formed in my mind, and I tentatively asked him, "Boss Sue, what if we don't buy the workshop, but invest in it? You'll still be the boss and handle the technical part, and we'll be the shareholders, responsible for sales." Boss Sue looked at us for a long time, his eyes clouded with indecision, but eventually, he agreed. Lily and I were overjoyed. To celebrate, we went out to eat at a restaurant. That happiness lasted until we arrived home, only to see Oscar and Lily's husband standing in front of my door. Chapter 5. Susanna. Oscar stared at me for a long time, his eyes slightly red. He hesitated, trying to speak but finally only managed to call my name in a hoarse voice. I shot him a cold glance, feeling the fleeting happiness from earlier completely vanish. With an icy expression, I said, "What are you doing here?" Oscar, caught off guard by my cold attitude, stood there for a moment in silence. Then, in a timid voice, he said, "I came to find you. If I remember correctly, we no longer have any relationship." I replied, barely sparing him a glance. I couldn't understand how he had gone from being indifferent to suddenly acting like this, traveling all the way here to find me. Oscar took something wrapped in an envelope from his bag and placed it in my hand. He said, "This is the medal for the Advanced Worker Award, along with some money. The section chief asked me to give it to you." I felt the weight of the circular medal in my hand, and a sour feeling rose in my chest. In my past life, I had cried for a long time after losing this award. Oscar had bought me a cheap imitation medal then. At that time, I was so happy, thinking he had bought it specially because he cared about my feelings. I had no idea it was only because he had used my vulnerability to strip me of the eligibility for the award, and that he felt guilty seeing me cry. I took the medal, glanced at him indifferently, and said, "If there's nothing else, I'll head home now." Home was just a few steps away, but Oscar grabbed my wrist, preventing me from moving any further. I lowered my eyes to look at his hand on my wrist. Feeling a sense of irony, I reminded him, "This is a public place. Aren't you afraid of ruining your image as a teacher by pulling me around like this?" Oscar visibly stiffened, but he still didn't let go of my hand. After a long pause, he mumbled, "I still have something to say. Let me take you home." I couldn't believe my ears when I heard this. I raised my head to look at him, then, after a long moment, let out a cold laugh and asked, "What? Are you trying to take me back so Isolde can vent her frustration about not getting the advanced worker spot?" This was his usual trick, both in this life and the previous one. Always a sweet gesture followed by a harsh slap. He would show me kindness, only to remind me that every time he suddenly seemed nice to me, it was for a reason. And that reason was always for Isolde. Oscar jerked his hand back, and I stumbled into his arms. This was the first hug between us. His hands held my waist tightly, locking me in place. With a trembling voice, he said, "I know I was wrong last time. I've thought about it a lot these past few days. I didn't care for you enough before, but I will change. Please, come home with me." The way he spoke was as humble as he could manage, but my heart was as cold as ice, and I had no emotion at all. I pushed him away forcefully. Oscar's face showed confusion, hesitation, and frustration, mixed with some anger. "I've come this far to apologize. Don't be so stubborn. What more do you want me to do?" At that moment, I finally saw that nothing had changed about him. The previous gestures of kindness were just a cover-up. In front of me, he was always the one in a dominant position, self-assured, entitled, and fearless. So when he didn't get the response he expected from me, he teetered on the edge of impatience, ready to lash out. I faced his anger calmly and asked, "Oscar, you're the one who came looking for me. Now you think you've humbled yourself enough. Don't you find it ridiculous?" Oscar's face darkened. He stared at me for a moment, and after a long silence, he softened his tone. "Okay, I was wrong just now. My tone was too harsh. I've just been worried about you these past few days. You haven't been home for a month. If Lily hadn't left her husband and tracked you down, I wouldn't have known you were so far away." As he spoke, his gaze remained fixed on me, as though trying to read some hidden emotion behind my calm demeanor. What did he want to see? I guessed it was surprise, shock, maybe even excitement, thinking that a few more sweet words would make me follow him back. But that would never happen. I turned my face away and saw Lily dealing with her own version of this scenario, just as impatiently as I was. "I've told you countless times, we have no relationship anymore." I was done playing these games with Oscar. I shrugged off his grip, entered the house, and locked the door behind me. Oscar stood outside, knocking incessantly, his voice pleading. "Susanna, I was wrong just now. Please, come out. Let's talk. Soon." A neighbor from next door came out and shouted, "What's all the noise? Stop knocking. She doesn't want to see you. You're disturbing my child's homework." Chapter 6. After that, the knocking stopped, and Oscar apologized repeatedly before leaving. Feeling a bit more upbeat, I made 3 dishes and brought them over to Lily's place, hoping we could talk all night. To my surprise, she had also cooked 3 dishes. We exchanged a smile, and Lily said, "I never imagined he would lower himself like this to beg me." The table couldn't fit all 6 dishes, and I couldn't help but laugh. It felt like the start of a new life, as if now, after everything, life was finally beginning. We opened 2 bottles of soda, clinked glasses, and I laughed freely. Boss Sue has agreed. I think this is what a new beginning looks like. Breaking away from Oscar, moving past that self-doubting relationship, and now stepping into a business venture, everything felt like a blessing. The next day, after finishing up with our stall, Lily and I met with Boss Sue. He explained the management of workshop workers, how to inspect the finished products, and gave us a suggestion. "Why don't you and Lily take a mechanical manufacturing class? You don't need to learn everything, just the process and the standard specifications for electrical products." We could tell that Boss Sue had deep affection for the workshop. Before leaving, he reminded us, "Make sure to check in every day." I waved and smiled. "Don't worry, we're shareholders now." Lily and I followed his advice and enrolled in the class. We continued running the breakfast stall, dreaming of one day expanding the workshop into a factory. Another half-month passed, and the workshop completed a batch of color TVs. Boss Sue returned from his hometown. When we discussed selling them, he said, "We have a tricky problem. Raw materials have gotten much more expensive, but the price for color TVs in Guangdong is still just 260 yuan. If we raise the price, they won't sell." Lily nudged me. "Do you remember how much the color TVs sold for in our village? I think it was over 470 yuan. I nodded. "Our TVs come from Guangdong, so the price has definitely gone up." Suddenly, an idea struck me. I slammed my hand on the table. "We can ship the color TVs to the south to sell." We quickly worked out the shipping costs, the rental of a truck, and calculated that each TV could be sold for over 100 yuan more than in Guangdong. Lily and I paused our breakfast stall for a week, rented a truck, and hired drivers to transport the TVs south. We sold a full truckload. After returning to Guangdong, we counted the earnings, over 10,000 yuan. We shared the good news with Boss Sue, and we were both overjoyed. I also told him about the next plan, to use this money to buy a delivery truck and hire 2 more drivers, expanding our transportation business. Boss Sue thought it was a good idea and took 30,000 yuan out of the 40,000 we had previously invested, leaving us to manage it. The plan went into action for 3 months, not only giving us enough money to expand the workshop, but also establishing a reputation in the southern market. We also expanded into the transportation business, offering a 20 yuan discount for the southern market on deliveries from our factory. News got around, and the section chief from our village wrote to me, asking if I could help him find a way to get in on it. I shared with him our plans to expand the workshop into a factory and mentioned that if he was interested, he could invest. The section chief, along with several other factory officials, pooled together 50,000 yuan to invest in us. Boss Su found a good location, and with great fanfare, we moved the workshop to a larger facility. In just 2 months, Lily and I became shareholders in an electrical appliance factory. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Boss Su, grinning with joy, said, "Susanna, do you have some sort of foresight? How is it everything we do goes so smoothly? In less than 6 months, we've established a factory." Lily also smiled and said, "When I came to find you, I never imagined we'd make money. I just wanted to have something of my own, and I never thought it would turn into this much success." I smiled and complimented both of them. It's all thanks to everyone's collaboration. After the ceremony, we went to a restaurant. It was a bit stuffy inside, so I stepped outside for some fresh air. And there, I saw Oscar. Honestly, it wasn't surprising. He'd come to Guangdong to find me once, about 4 months ago, but I had coldly brushed him off, and he disappeared for a while. Since then, he had shown up repeatedly in Guangdong, appearing in front of me, wanting to say something but never quite daring to. For 4 months, it had been the same routine. I had always ignored him, not responding, though sometimes I would see takeout boxes or new clothes wrapped in plastic bags outside my door. Eventually, I decided to move. I bought a 50 square meter apartment and started living there alone. This was the first time I'd seen him in almost a month. The section chief had written me a letter, which was full of subtle hints. It seemed to suggest that he had applied for a leave of absence, planning to find someone, but would return. It also mentioned that a soul had been fired from the factory, and Oscar had been the one to report her. It seemed Oscar had intentionally been waiting outside for me. When he saw me, he slowly walked up to me, his voice quiet. "I need to talk to you." I gave him a cold look. There was nothing left to say between us. Just as I was about to leave, he grabbed my arm, but only for a moment, before quickly releasing it. His voice was hoarse, and he lowered his head, not daring to look at me. There was a hint of a sob in his voice when he said, "Once I say this, I'll be able to let go." Chapter 7. I stood there in silence for a long time, watching him in the wind. Oscar, wearing thin, worn clothes, looked desolate and defeated, as if a single word could easily break him down. His face, still the same as it had been in the past, was the handsome face I had once loved. But back then, he always carried himself with arrogance, dismissing everything in front of him. Now, standing before me with his head lowered and posture humble, this was the first time I had seen him like this. "Say it. You have 5 minutes." I glanced at my watch and coldly spoke. Oscar, restless, said, I've been in Guangdong, staying close to you." I gave a brief response. I noticed. He kept looking at me, but still couldn't find any emotion on my face. With a defeated tone, he continued, "Susanna, I wasn't willing to accept this. After all these years, how could we break up because of a soul? I've regretted my impulsiveness countless times. I hate myself for not being steadfast, for always thinking about how a soul saved my father's life. So I felt the need to repay her, even if it meant hurting you with your secret." I stared into the distance, my eyes dim, silent. 6 months had passed, and he still didn't understand why I chose to leave him. He only thought that if he hadn't revealed my secret, perhaps I wouldn't have left without looking back. The wind ruffled his hair, which had grown longer, and his unshaven face made him look nothing like the so-called respectable figure he once was. His face was right in front of me, the same one I had seen countless times in the past. Yet now, my vision seemed blurred, reduced to just a vague outline. Perhaps it was love that had made his image so deeply engraved in my memory. After falling out of love, even his specific features faded into nothing but a blurry shape. His voice cracked as he continued, "I've seen it all these days. Without me, you're doing better." I wrapped my coat tightly around myself, observing his tears with the same cold detachment he once showed me. After a moment of silence, I spoke. Oscar, it wasn't just one thing that made me leave you, but rather something much deeper. He raised his tearful eyes to look at me, his gaze filled with sorrow and confusion, his voice hoarse. He replied, I know, it's because I didn't care for you enough. I rejected his answer and said firmly, it's because I see our future. I see that for the next 20 years, you'll still like Isolde. This is just a temporary interruption, a brief denial of your feelings for her. He shook his head, firmly rejecting my words. No, I've come to understand my heart. I only feel gratitude for her. Susanna, all along, the person I've loved is you. I'm used to you being around, talking to me all the time. Without you, my home is so quiet, so uncomfortable. So many unexpected things had happened this lifetime, things that could even be described as shocking. Oscar confessing his love to me was one of them. I calmly interrupted him. Then you'll have to get used to it, because from now on, I will never be by your side again. Suddenly, he closed his lips, his brow furrowed, not in anger but in sorrow. For the first time, I felt a pang of pity for Oscar. His head hung low, as if he wanted to say something but didn't dare. Whether it was the wind or his overwhelming sadness, his shoulders trembled constantly. After my words, he seemed like a puppet without a soul, staring blankly at the floor, letting his tears fall freely. I remained indifferent, then continued. Actually, it doesn't matter that you've confessed. At least now, nothing can hurt me anymore. I won't be hurt by anyone again. Susanna. Oscar looked at me deeply, opening his mouth several times but finally muttering, I'm sorry. I didn't acknowledge his apology and simply glanced at my watch, speaking with no patience. The time's up. I have to go in now. Oscar didn't chase after me. He remained frozen in place until we finished eating and came out. Still standing there, when Lily saw him, she whispered, How did he find his way here? I casually replied, Who knows? He's just being pathetic. Lily nodded and, smiling, said, You know, my ex-husband was adamantly against the divorce, right? But recently, he agreed, and now I have no more worries. That's great. We should go out again tomorrow to celebrate. I smiled and turned to look at her. Just then, I caught a glimpse of Oscar, still standing, watching me intently. He had been following my every movement. As soon as our eyes met, he forced a stiff, awkward smile, just like the first time we met in the previous life. Back then, I thought, he's so cute. But now, all I felt was annoyance. I quickly turned away and continued walking. Lily and I, along with the company we built, created our own electrical appliance brand. Our sales in the southern market had been so successful that many businesses approached us for cooperation. The first bucket of gold we earned, I shared with Lily the news that property prices would rise in a few years. Without asking where I had heard it from, Lily used all her savings to invest in real estate. Together, we invested in the construction industry, diving into the real estate business. The dividends from the factory came quarterly. The section chief and the others had already received their share, so I called him to get his bank account number to transfer the money. To my surprise, the section chief said, I never planned to take this money back. Keep it for yourself. I found it odd that he refused, insisting on sending the money back. After hesitating for a long time, he finally told me the truth. Susanna, actually, that 50,000 yuan was given to you by Oscar. He said if he gave it to you directly, you wouldn't accept it, so he asked me to send it to you as an investment. He explained, in everyone's eyes, what you're doing in business is just a small operation, and it won't be long before you lose money. No one else had planned to invest in me, but when Oscar found out, he gave them the passbook to send the money. I thought about it for a moment, then decided to send the money to the section chief. I told him, the factory can't keep up with its old days. Keep this money to help the laid-off workers in the future. The people from the old factory weren't bad to me, and this money was a way to repay the kindness they once showed me. Lily finally received her divorce papers from her ex-husband, and she dragged me to a photo studio to take a picture. Looking at the photo, I realized how much we had changed since a year ago. We were braver, stronger. Lily caressed the photo and, through tears, smiled and said, "Susanna, I never imagined I'd end up living like this." I was overwhelmed with emotion as well, and said through tears, "Everything from the past is behind us. From now on, we'll live well." I believe that.